Module 7 now, we're going to wrap up towards the end of the lifespan, talking about the adult and the last three stages of Erik Erickson's lifespan perspective, the psychosocial theories of development. And so let's talk about the adult self-concept. And the good news is, or I guess it's good if you have high self-esteem, is that you'd see a pretty relatively stable self-esteem throughout adulthood. Personality also tends to be fairly stable, but let's go ahead and talk about self-esteem. So remember, we talked about in the previous modules the ideal versus real self and the difference, and that when you go in from childhood into adolescence, you begin to see a widening of the ideal self to the real self. And at an early age, that's really not a big deal. But of course, if it stays this way throughout adulthood, you begin to get depressed because you're never living up to what you truly wanted to be. But the good news is, as you get older, you begin to readjust that ideal self to match a little bit better to your real self. So the gap closes over time, and it becomes more in line with who you really are. So you begin to evaluate yourself with kind of different standards, and you begin to compare yourself to more those of the same age as you, and what most other people have achieved. And so when you do that, it becomes more realistic. So, for example, I'll give myself as an example. So I played some basketball when I was in high school, a little bit in college. And in high school, at least early high school, I would compare myself to some of the phenoms in the field. A retired basketball player, Shaquille O'Neal, was one of those players. And you say, well, look, at the same age, he was in the NBA, he was an all-star, and that's could maybe be my ideal basketball self. Quickly became evident that while I had okay skills, that I was never going to be in the NBA by a long shot. And so I had to readjust myself. And then I began to think of, well, maybe I can go in longer into academics and graduate school and such. And now it gets to the point where I'm comparing myself to maybe, say, other school psychologists who are also professors. And then invariably, I'm going to measure much better than when I was comparing myself to, say, a Hall of Fame NBA player who was roughly my same age. So that's what we mean by kind of readjusting there. And when you do that, you usually see that self-esteem really kind of stabilize and maybe even go up a little bit because you're no longer kind of reaching for that pie in the sky. And when you do that, it really relates to kind of those stable personality traits that I was talking about earlier. And there's really, there could be a little bit of personality growth between adolescence and going into middle adulthood. So kind of that age 20 to say 35-ish. But you really, from age, say, 35, 40 on up into late adulthood, personality tends not to change, with a couple of exceptions. So if you get in poor biological health, so let's say you have heart problems, so the blood isn't pumping as well to other areas of especially the brain, that could have a negative impact, or health problems that can change personality. If you have a tumor in your brain, things like that can really impact your personality. You could also have things like changes in your social environment. So friends for many, many years and stuff, all of a sudden they die or move away. That can impact things. And maybe if you have a poor fit between you and your environment, those can change things. But as I was saying back when we talked about the social learning perspective on personality, that doesn't really happen that often. And so we do see this real stability over time with personality. I did want to mention that one of the nice things in personality or personality traits is that optimism has been related to people living longer. So there's a whole realm that we're not going to be getting into in our class called positive psychology. Martin Seligman is one of the ones that's really associated with that, and really talk about the power of kind of what positive thinking, reframing things that happen to you in life in a more positive framework, can really have some long-term real outcomes like living longer. So, you can always try to help yourself reorient if you tend to be a more pessimistic thinker to become more optimistic over time. So in this next slide here, it's just going to really get at the stability of self-esteem over the years. And as you can see here, Generally, young children, before they go through puberty, tend to have pretty high self-esteem. You do see a dip there right in a middle school, kind of bottoming out when we talk about college, when there's still a lot of things unknown. And then you start to see that growth again, and then stability starting in about your 30s, and then actually in your mid to late 50s, early 60s. So right before retirement, that kind of lead up to retirement, you're at your professional height. You probably have the most buying power. You just have a lot more confidence what's happening. And then the declines there are probably related more to biological changes, but also societal ones or social ones, because individuals, friends of many years and stuff begin to die. And of course, we're not in as good a physical health. So really the 70s on, you begin to see declines in self-esteem, as you might imagine, because you're not able to do as much as maybe you had before. Okay, next slide here is just kind of the rank order consistency of personality trait measures. This is just looks once again at stability of personality. So the other slide had more self-esteem focus, and then this is more personality traits. And as you can see here, children tend to be the most unstable, but even that is a 0.31 consistency, which is pretty good for that age. As you can see, college students is at 0.54, and then going on up from there, and then, of course, later adulthood. So now we're going to look at what Erickson said about adulthood, because the last one that we talked about in the previous module was adolescence, and the fact that they have your focus on identity versus role confusion. And identity is probably Erickson's best known stage. Now, Erickson said if we finally figure out who we are, then we are ready for true intimacy. So there is pressure in usually emerging adulthood, early 20s, that you need to achieve some sort of identity with another person. And so you kind of combine. So I always kind of like the way that various celebrity couples would have their two first names blended together, quite literally showing this intimacy, psychological intimacy that Erickson always talked about. But the idea is that you have to have a good sense of who you are before you can commit to others. And so I would see this frequently when you talk about relationships. If somebody came in for, say, relationship counseling, and there would be this pattern of where people would get real close and then they would pull apart and get real close, pull apart. And inevitably what that would mean is that one of the people really didn't have a good sense who they were. And that when they got too close to this other person, they may have become worried about being subsumed by that person's kind of identity and not having their own. And so then they would kind of do something to kind of bring them apart more. And then the process kind of repeats itself until ultimately the relationship either breaks up or that person finally kind of figures out who they are and are able to truly meld themselves together. And so when they finally do that, when they can commit to another individual, kind of meld their identities together, that's going to be that next stage. A lot of times you might see that where they decide to become married and things like that. So that's intimacy versus isolation. That's going to happen probably in emerging adulthood. Now, around middle age, you have generativity versus stagnation. And so the real focus here is the capacity to generate or produce something that's going to outlive you, and that you generally care for the welfare of future generations, because the thing that's going to outlive you is probably not going to be your writing. It's not the movie that you shot. It's going to be your progeny or your people that you have relations and that you care for. And so you try to prepare the next generation to be able to succeed. And in a way, you outlive then your normal lifespan by the values and things that you impact on them, on that future generation. And so you stop trying to climb that corporate ladder and you make more sacrifices so that your children or those that you're caring for can carry on beyond you. So that's the generativity versus stagnation. And then integrity versus despair. This is towards the end of the lifespan. And you're trying to find a sense of meaning in your life. And it's going to help you face the inevitability of death. So one of the things that you engage in is something called a life review. And this is when elderly adults look back on any unresolved conflicts of the past in order to really come to terms with themselves, find new meaning and coherence in their lives, and then prepare for death. And I think that this has a lot of appeal. If you've ever been around older people when they are at the end stages of life, they don't seem to be panicked. A lot of times they feel like it's the natural order of things, that they have lived a good life. And a lot of times they spend more time comforting the younger people who are living than needing to be comforted. And I think that's because they've engaged in this life review, and there's a sense of finality and the sense of satisfaction with a life well lived in many cases. And so that's what Erickson's really talking about when we talk about the very last of his stages. Now, the good news is that Erickson's stages seem to be partially, but maybe not fully supported. And remember, he was a Freudian, a neo-Freudian. So some of the crazy things that we talked about with Freud, if you read Erickson's original writings, you see some of the signs there. It makes it hard to necessarily prove or disprove. And so that's why we say partially supported. But there's a lot to this kind of lifespan perspective and how the change of focus from who am I and my identity achievement to melding with another person to trying to live longer through others and younger generations and finally coming to terms with my own mortality. And that's pretty consistent in what we see. So now we've kind of gotten to death and dying at the very end of Erickson's life stages. We're going to go back in the last module for this chapter and talk about something called the midlife crisis, and then, of course, retirement, which a lot of us look forward to once we've been working for a number of years. So tune in for that last module for here, this chapter 11.